The truth behind Senator Ron Wyden's questions for RFK Jr. The entire predatory industrial complex of the United States opposes RFK Jr.'s confirmation. While the full dissection of the hearing would be an incredible project, the sheer dishonesty of certain senators who are little more than mouthpieces for corporate interests means that just debunking 5 of them could easily take over 30 minutes. Even before deep diving into the confirmation hearing, I already know that most of my work will involve dismantling the legacy media's narrative, which focuses more on how RFK Jr. makes people feel rather than the substance of what he's saying. That's the game they play. It's the same playbook they used against Trump. Saturate the airwaves with smears, misrepresent his words, and make sure that your black grandmother, your out-of-touch older cousins, and every well-meaning but ill-informed Democrat automatically write him off. All because he had the courage to team up with the greatest president of all time. Even voices we once considered champions of the people, figures who built their brands on fighting the system, have been absorbed into the very institutions they once criticized. They've turned against RFK Jr., not because he's wrong, but for their own self-interest and because he's a threat to those self-interests. And nowhere is that threat more apparent than in the way that senators like Bernie Sanders, a complete fraud, which we'll get into, and Elizabeth Warren, another so-called progressive who sold out, and Ron Wyden, one of the slimiest of them all, handled their questioning. We're going to start with Senator Ron Wyden. And from the moment Wyden begins speaking, he was smearing RFK Jr. He didn't start with policy data or even a serious critique. He went straight to vague, non-specific podcasts and interview transcripts, admitting outright that he was more focused on who RFK Jr. had spoken to rather than what he had actually said. That alone should tell you everything you need to know. Wyden then claimed that RFK Jr. fits the profile of someone who would make reckless recommendations, even if it meant endangering lives. This wasn't based on actual policy failures or harmful actions, just empty character assassinating assertion. He went on to link RFK Jr. to quacks and conspiracy theorists over his vaccine criticisms, despite the fact that RFK Jr. is not an anti-vaxxer. He's an environmental lawyer with a long history of exposing corporate malfeasance. Wyden's most egregious misrepresentation was his attempt to blame RFK Jr. for vaccine hesitancy in Samoa. The truth? Hesitation stemmed from a real and documented disaster on July 6, 2018, when 2-month-old infants died after nurses incorrectly prepared the MMR vaccine, mixing it with expired atracinium. That tragedy caused understandable fear, and RFK Jr. visited Samoa after the fact to document what had happened. He detailed that in his book. And yet, Wyden still tried to pin the blame on him. Funny how none of the billion-dollar corporations RFK Jr. exposes have managed to sue him for libel or slander. Why? Because he's telling the truth. Let's tap into Wyden's hypocrisy next. Wyden's problems isn't just that he lies, it's that he has no issue with people changing their views as long as they're changing in the direction he approves of. RFK Jr. has publicly evolved on certain positions, but instead of acknowledging that as a sign of intellectual honesty, Wyden used it to attack him. Meanwhile, Wyden has consistently voted for every single measure that has harmed the American people, including funding the endless war in Ukraine, Iraq War 2.0. The only decent vote on his record is his opposition to the War Powers Resolution that led to the authorization for use of military force, or the AUMF. That's it. As for his claim that RFK Jr. wanted to pause vaccination research for 8 years, I searched extensively and I found no proof of that statement. If evidence surfaces, I'll correct the record, but so far it looks like more baseless fear-mongering. And last but not least, we had the abortion misdirection, where Ron Wyden then tried to frame RFK Jr. as a threat to his abortion rights, bringing up the medication methylprednisolone, which causes heavy menstrual bleeding in 10% of the women who take it after an abortion. Instead of addressing the concern in good faith, Wyden spun it into a fear-mongering narrative, suggesting that RFK Jr.'s openness to any restrictions meant that he was secretly plotting a full abortion ban. In reality, this line of questioning felt more like a pharmaceutical ad for methylprednisolone than a genuine inquiry. Wyden wasn't interested in protecting women. He was interested in protecting his profits. And as expected, he ended with more empty moralizing, more emotional appeals, and more unhinged ranting about Trump. He straight up called RFK Jr. unqualified while failing to provide a single solid reason why. RFK's response was a brutal reality check. RFK didn't just counter Wyden's nonsense, he obliterated it. In his opening statement, he gave a nod to his family, and then he laid out the scathing failures of the United States healthcare system in a way that no career politician could, not even Bernie Sanders. He didn't rely on empty rhetoric, he backed it up with facts. And one of the most damning things? Healthcare-related costs make up 1/5 of our GDP, yet we have the worst healthcare outcomes in the developed world. And that right there is why they fear him. RFK Jr. threatens the status quo, the corrupt institutions, and the corporate political pipeline that keeps America sick and dependent. That's why Wyden smeared him. That's why the media ignores his actual policies. And that's why even so-called progressives had turned against him. Because if RFK Jr. succeeds, then the whole house of cards comes crashing down.